Hello everyone and welcome to eFlow's Net Interviews. I'm Michael McLean, a professor of ecohydrology here at IHE Delft, and I'm joined today by Sergio Salinas of WWF Mexico. Sergio, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Michael, for the invitation. My pleasure.
Yeah. We're here to discuss the Mexican Water Reserves Program and the announcement on June 5th by the President of Mexico that environmental flows have now been protected in 300 basins across the country. That amounts to more than 50% of the runoff of Mexico, so it's an extraordinary announcement. Sergio, we want to talk about this in three parts. First, we want to discuss a little bit the background, how we came to this point today.
Yeah.
Then we're going to talk about the decree itself, the decrees themselves, and what's actually been protected. And then at the end, we'll spend a few minutes talking about the future and where we go from here.
Okay.
So why don't we begin with how we got here? I mean, when did this process begin of establishing environmental flows in Mexico? And yes, what were the series of activities that led to this announcement?
Yeah, the first key thing that happened in Mexico was the National Standard for Determining Environmental Flows publication back in 2012. Cool. And in 1 year before, when the project was already agreed by the technical group that analyzed that and developed that, the National Water Commission and WWF, in alliance with the Gonzalo Riaronte Foundation, conducted a feasibility study to identify particularly river basins with high ecological importance values and low water pressure from water users, to identify those river basins in which we could apply the Mexican standard once it was published, and to deliver the results for protecting water for the environment.
That was an excellent strategy. Huh? Those were low-hanging fruit in the sense that these were river basins, as you said, high ecological value, low pressures, and therefore there was unlikely to be a lot of controversy or conflict over protecting reserves in those.
Yes. When the country was about to start to implement the national standard, there were some stakeholders that were afraid of implementing the national standard without any knowledge in determining environmental flows. The National Water Commission particularly wanted to start in the less thorny road possible for the country. So back in that time, that the National Water Commission decided to go for this.
Yeah. So tell me about the process of assessing environmental flows in Mexico.
Yeah, we start to conduct the studies focusing on the hydrological conditions of the flood regime, and so the Mexican standard states that we should to conduct the studies based on base flows for dry years for average years at least, but in other cases, depending on each context and the methodology that we apply based on the standard, we could even analyze as well very dry conditions, dry, average, and wet conditions, and additionally the peak flow regime for at least three type of floods events to integrate to the environmental flow proposals.
All right, so a flow regime is protected, and are those values rolled up into an annual total or some other summation?
Yes. In addition of the regime for seasonal or base flow conditions for these hydrological conditions and the flood regime, in addition of that, the environmental flow studies should also deliver an annual volume of water reserve in this case, what is going to turn into an environmental water reserve, and that is because the final outcome of the environmental flow assessment should be integrated into the water balance of each river basin in Mexico.
Okay, and that's going to be important for the implementation phase
Yeah.
as well, and the
Level.
Thanks. Then, so that's the background. It's been work over several years by a large number of Mexican specialists in cooperation with many organizations that provided the input that was the basis for the decrees that the president approved. So excellent. Thank you. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the rivers that have been protected.
Yeah, well, the most important river basin that was announced as part of these 10 decrees was the Usumacinta River. The Usumacinta River is located in southern Mexico. It is an international sharing basin with Guatemala. And there the environmental water reserve was set somewhere between a 90 and a 99%. A 90 right before it joins to the Grijalva River in lowlands, and a 99% in near to the border with Guatemala.
When you say 99%, 99% of what?
Of the mean annual runoff, I'm sorry.
99% of the mean annual runoff of that.
So
that's essentially all the water. It's essentially protecting it as a free-flowing river.
Yeah, essentially is to protect it as a free-flowing river.
Yeah, extraordinary. Well, what else? Any other basins you want to mention?
I will say also the San Pedro Mezquital River. The San Pedro River is located in western Mexico. It's one of the few that crosses the western Sierra Madre. It connects the Chihuahuan Desert with the Gulf of California. It discharges in the Gulf of California in the largest mangrove forest from the Mexican Pacific coast, or in fact, I will say that in the whole Mexican coastline. And there, the decree that was established for that river was published back in 2014, and it is also basically to keep it as a free-flowing river. The reserve there is between the 80 and 82% of the mean annual runoff.
Amazing. So, to date, there have been 13 decrees protecting 300 reserves, and really it has protected the most important rivers in the country from an ecological perspective. So what about the long-term goals? As we know, some catchments and basins in Mexico really are already overexploited, and there is conflict and large pressures. Is the hope, is the goal that there will eventually be environmental reserves for
Eventually more.
water reserves for the environment across the entire country?
Yeah, some of the reserves that were published a few days ago, they could have that situation. So that was fine, and that was part of the first phase. In the next phase, one of the purpose of the water resource program was to build capacities and strengthening capacities of water managers
as well,
and academics to implement the national standard for determining environmental flows, to have this exercise not only from the perspective of hydrological methodologies, but also to have the possibility of conducting studies within an holistic approach, and in other cases where it was possible, habitat simulation approach. So in the next step, it considers to implement the national standard not only in the initial target river basins, which were 189, and not only in this moment around 300 river basins with environmental water reserves. In the next phase will consider the whole country.
All right.
Not necessarily to publish environmental water reserves in the legal status of a decree, of a presidential decree, but at least to integrate the environmental water needs into the water balance of each of the Mexican river basins.
All right. Well, congratulations to Mexico. This has been an extraordinary effort, extraordinary achievement. Around the world, people have been paying attention to this because Mexico has chosen an innovative way forward. And they've really developed an approach that works for them. And I guess so much has been learned. I'm wondering if there are opportunities to apply that learning elsewhere, or is this approach something that you feel like could be applied more widely, for example, in Latin America?
Yeah, I totally believe that. One of the key lessons learned from the program, it was to start putting the environment into the center of the discussion, and to build capacities in implementing the environmental national standard, and learning by doing, essentially. And one key component of the whole strategy was to start in the less thorny possible road for the National Water Commission, and that was on river basins with high ecological importance,
Right.
in river basins with really low water pressure. And just to conclude, I will say that having the environment as the warrantor, as the warrantor of sustainable limits of water abstraction, is a really preventive approach of managing water and natural resources. And what we have learned is that almost in any country would be some river basins or a bunch of river basins with high ecological importance values and really low water pressure from water users.
Right.
So that is the first step, what we need to identify to start the study. I mean, at national scale.
All right, so absolutely something for everyone to learn from this example. Well, I think we've covered a lot of terrain. We've talked about how we arrived at this point, all of the work that's gone on in past years, environmental assessments, cooperation that led us to the announcement of the President on the 5th. We learned a little bit about the content of that announcement, and also about where we're headed in the future. So any other final remarks before we close?
Yeah. I just would like to recognize, of course, the National Water Commission, who has lead all this strategy, the Inter-American Development Bank as one of the main funding source, the alliance between WWF and Gonzalo Riorronte Foundation, and of course a lot of people that have participated, and institutions, or something that's coming from government agencies, from the academy and NGOs, and yeah.
Excellent. Well, it's so important to highlight all the important actors involved, because something as big as what was announced on the 5th cannot happen without an extraordinary amount of cooperation. So, Sergio, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Michael.
And thank you all for having spent this time with us. We've really only been able to touch on some of the highlights of this important announcement and all the work that's gone into it. So we're going to include some references, links to those references, in the comments section or below this video. So I hope you'll explore some of those to learn more about the approach that Mexico's taking. And I hope you'll come again and listen to future interviews when we invite other important actors in the world of environmental flow science and practice to discuss these topics with us here. Thank you very much.